Hello everyone and welcome back to our scenario-based demo. So happy to see you here again. We're doing like a quick pulse check to see if everything is okay and if you find all the information that we're providing beneficial, useful, and also would love to hear some feedback. So feel free to leave any comments below and we will make sure to read them. We were wondering about the length, the content, or anything that you have in mind, just put it in the feedback. And with that, let's start with our next episode. So today's episode, we're going to do a short recap of our previous episode. We're going to talk about the Content Classification Taxonomy, recap, and we're also going to demo our sensitivity labels for content. Let's start with a recap. So in the previous episode, we discussed Azure Information Protection, aka AIP scanner, and how to use it effectively to discover sensitive information on your on-premise environment. Those are network shares and SharePoint servers. First, Brendan summarized the SBD environment setup and components. Then he went over the AIP scanner architecture, requirements, and recommended configuration. Then Walid took us through a detailed demo on how we set up the environment, prereqs for the AIP scanner, as well as setting it up, configuring it, and review the repository discovery outcomes. Now let's do a short recap on our MIP sensitivity labels. As you recall, in the second episode of this SBD, we discussed our classification taxonomy for content, including how did we actually come up with it, the details of each classification category, and the protective controls we decided to put against each classification. Just as a reminder, we have decided that we will have 4 classification labels. Those were public, general, confidential, and highly confidential. I will now hand it over to Mecca to walk us through the demo. Thank you, and hopefully you enjoy it.
G'day everyone, it's Macca here. Welcome back. I hope you've been enjoying all of the sick content we've had for you thus far. Now, what we're going to do today in this particular demo is we're going to set up the labels for our organization purely for files and emails, so unstructured data. What I'm going to do is take you through the wizard and how we will build each of those labels for public, general, confidential recipients only, confidential internal only, and highly confidential. And you'll see how they slightly differ from each other for our particular environment. Okay, so the first label we're going to be creating is our public label. So our public label is going to be for information that can be used by everyone inside or outside the business. So as we can see when I open up the sensitivity label wizard, the first thing it's going to ask me for are a name and a display name. The name is the internal name to the tenant. There can only be one unique name per label inside the tenant. The display names, however, can be non-unique. So for example, I may have a requirement for confidential employees only and highly confidential employees only. These 2 labels would need a display name of employees only. However, I couldn't have that same name as the base name inside the tenant. So it's just a little thing to be aware of. Now, in this case, I'm going to create the label name internally as public and the display name additionally is public. Now, the description for users is going to be the information that appears on the tooltip when the user mouses over that particular label. So in this case, we're going to put in the informational area here of this information can be used by everyone inside or outside the business. The description for admins is purely internally to the system so that the admins can get an idea of what the label does. We don't need to put anything in there. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is the scope. Now, the scope determines whether or not the label will appear in the list for files and emails, in this case, unstructured data. And you'll notice that groups and sites is grayed out. Now, this would normally be used for Office 365 groups, SharePoint sites, or Microsoft Teams. We haven't actually turned this on in the tenant yet, so you can see it's grayed out. Additionally, we have Azure Purview assets. Now, this is when we want to go and label our assets in Azure, such as SQL Azure, files in Azure Blob Storage, and other things like that. Now, it's turned on in our tenant, but we're not using it right now, so we're just going to untick that and we're purely going to create the label for files and emails in this case. The next thing we do is we decide whether or not we need encryption or content marking. Now, if you think back to SBD episode 1, you'll know that the protective controls for the public classification are no encryption, no access restrictions, but we will visually mark the document. So in this case, we simply want to tick mark the content of files and leave encrypt files and emails completely blank. So we hit the next button, and now it asks us to define our content marking. Now, when we work with content marking in the wizard, we can deal with a watermark, a header, and a footer. And we can do a certain amount of stuff with this, but with PowerShell, we can do a little bit more. So in this case, we're going to add our watermark like so. We'll customize that text. And in this case, we're going to choose just a simple text of classification-public like so. And I can choose to change the font size, the font color, as well as the text layout. Now, in this case, we've decided to use green for our font color for the public label, and I'll click save like so. And I do some similar stuff with the header and footer. So in this case, I'll put in the text again, change this to green, and notice when it comes to a header and footer, I can choose where to align this, the left, center, or right. I like center as opposed to the watermark, which was diagonal or vertical. So I'll choose save, and then finally for the footer, we'll do a similar thing. No mistaking in this case that this is a public document. So now we move on. We're not doing any auto labeling for files and emails within the Office application here, and we'll come back to that at a later time. Obviously, our groups and sites are not turned on, therefore everything is grayed out. And of course, we're not using this for Azure Purview. That's all there is to it. I now hit Create Label. We submit that request to the tenant, and the label is now successfully created. So once this label, along with all of the other classification taxonomy, is published, we'll then be able to get access to those labels within the different apps that we're using. All right, so we can see now that we have our general label created as well. And we didn't bother to show you that because it's essentially identical to the public label. The general label is intended to be information which includes internal business data, which is not meant for public consumption. And this information can be used by all employees and can be shared with authorized customers and business partners as needed. Now, the thing here is we configured it identically to public. There's visual marking, no encryption, no access restrictions. Now, the next section deals with the confidential label. The confidential label is slightly different to the other labels we've had so far because it represents a parent label. Within confidential, we're going to have two sub-labels, recipients only and internal only. So we need to understand how to configure a parent label versus how to configure a child. Okay, so let's create the confidential parent label. In this case, we'll call it confidential. And we'll use the same description for users because they're not going to see that anyway. Now, we do have to configure at least one of these buttons in order for us to progress through the wizard. We're not actually going to configure any of this, but what we'll do is we'll simply choose files and emails. We'll leave everything blank like so and simply move through to the end of the wizard and create the label. And now that represents our parent label for the confidential sensitivity. So now what we want to do is create a sub-label, the first of our sub-labels being recipients only. Now, the recipients only label is designed for sensitive business information, which is meant to be consumed on a need-to-know basis. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add visual marking, and we're going to add encryption. And the encryption will essentially be do not forward, do not print, do not remove the encryption. So when we create this label on Word, Excel, or PowerPoint, it will spawn a custom permission dialog that allows us to choose what the user has, and we need to follow those protective controls. Or if we're in Outlook, it will apply do not forward. Now, in order to create a sub-label, rather than doing what we've done before, which is hit create a label, what we need to do is hit the ellipsis of the parent label and choose add a sub-label like so. Now what we're going to do is put in the appropriate name, which in this case is recipients only. I will highlight that and copy paste it. And then for the description for users, we'll make sure that they get the description they need based on what I was mentioning before, like so. This contains sensitive information on a need-to-know basis only. Now again, we're not using Purview, we're going for files and emails. But the difference now is that we're using encryption and we're using visual marking. So you can see we have a slightly different aspect to our wizard now, configuring the encryption settings. Now, because this is for recipients only, we want to make sure that the user assigns the permission when they apply the label. This now opens up a couple of options for us. What happens in Outlook versus what happens in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint. And this is very different from us setting the permissions ourselves to certain domains, certain users, and certain tenants. In this case, we're going to choose in Outlook, enforce do not forward, because remember, our requirement was no forward, no print, no encryption removal. And in Word, Excel, and PowerPoint, we're going to prompt the users to specify those permissions. Moving forward, we now have our very familiar by now content marking capability. And in this case, we're going to configure, as per usual, a watermark with the watermark text, confidential recipients only. We're going to choose black for the confidential color. And again, we'll do our header. In the center, I do love the center. You can choose whatever you like. And of course, the footer in the center. Now we move forward. Not auto-labeling at this point. No groups and sites, no purview, and now we create the label. So it's as simple as that, but you can see the distinction there between what we did last time. We've now moved into a point where the information is considered sensitive enough to encrypt it. And you've seen that we have the ability to encrypt on a per user basis, effectively customizing that permission when we apply the label. And the next thing we want to show you is how we can define the entire access control and permission set on that encryption in one go. Okay, now let's go and create the internal only sublabel of the confidential parent. So we'll add another sublabel like so, and we will give it a name of internal only, same display name. And in this case, this data includes sensitive business information and is meant to be accessed by internal employees only, because exposing this data to unauthorized users may cause damage to the business. So we're going to put that in our description so everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. Again, removing purview, and this time choosing to encrypt and to mark. Now, in this instance, the encryption settings are going to be assigned now. So we're going to build the access control list and the rights assignment for anyone that opens this particular document with this label. So in this case, we want to choose assign permissions now. Now we have a couple of other options that we can play with here. Firstly, user access to content expires. Now, if we drop that down, we can choose for access to the content to expire on a specific date or a number of days after the label is applied. So for instance, you might have a tender response that you need to respond to, and we want that to essentially expire or time bomb itself on a specific date. Now, in this case, we want to choose never. We're assuming that anything labeled as confidential internal only is not going to have an expiration date. Allowing offline access ensures that you can always open the document when offline. Now, if you choose never or only for a number of days, this requires me to connect to Azure RMS when I attempt to open the document, either every time if I choose never, or after a certain number of days if I choose a certain number of days. This doesn't work so well if my cached license has expired and I'm on a plane in the middle of the air and I have no internet access. So we tend to leave this as always, but it's up to you what you might want to do. And in our case, we're going to use always for our particular fictitious environment. Now we're going to assign permissions. Now, when I think about this, what we're doing with this particular label is we're encrypting it so that anyone inside the tenant can open it. Anyone outside the tenant will be blocked. But if you're inside the tenant, we don't want to restrict access at all once you're inside there. So what we'll do is we'll assign our permissions, and now we need to choose what permissions we're assigning. In this case, we're going to add the entire tenant. So we'll choose add all users and groups in your organization, and that then adds the entire tenant to the access control list, as opposed to adding any authenticated user, individual users and groups from the tenant, or specific email addresses or domains. This might be useful if you're communicating or collaborating with external parties. You'll notice that by default, it's created a permission set of co-author. And co-author actually has a bunch of capabilities associated with it, such as view content, view rights, edit content, save, print, copy, etc. Now we can actually choose to change these if we wish, And in this case, we might choose co-owner instead because we want no access restrictions whatsoever. Now you can see the difference here. Co-owner has every permission associated with it. Co-author loses the ability to edit rights, export content, and full control. Because we want no access restrictions, we're going to choose co-owner instead. We'll click save there, and you can see that that access control list is now filled out. We're not using double key encryption. Click next. And now, of course, we end up in our all too familiar content marking area. And again, because we're doing the watermark header and footer, we'll add those as necessary. Using black again, because remember, this is still part of the parent confidential, and we decided that we would use black for that parent label. Just add our footer in. So save that out, and again, skipping through to the end of the wizard and creating the label. So hopefully you can see here the difference between allowing users to assign the permissions when it comes to setting a label, as well as setting the permissions from an administrative point of view and automatically having those permissions push through the document. Okay, so now we can see our full taxonomy created, and you can see we have public, general, confidential, recipients only, confidential, internal only, and highly confidential. That's great, but at the moment, none of my users will see any of those labels inside their Office applications. So the next step that we need to go through is actually publishing those labels to the users that need them. So before we go any further, I want to hand it over to barbecue administrator and all-round good guy, Waleed, to show us what his Office applications look like right now before we publish any label policies.
Thanks, Maka. Hello again, everyone. As you can see, I'm logged to a Windows 10 machine, domain joined as a user.1. The user is not a local admin, he's not an administrator, etc. And we will see how it does look like on my Office apps. As you can see here in my Outlook client, I'm connected to my mailbox as user.1 at m365scdemo.live. And I am going to send an email to user2, put a random subject. Okay, so traditionally, when I try to label an email, I go to the sensitivity label button here, and then I can select whatever label published to me within the scope, as Maka showed you earlier. However, when I try to find the sensitivity label button here, I cannot find it. And the reason for this is there is no labels published to me at this stage. And hence why I cannot see it. That is similar to the web app as well. So if I go to my mailbox over Outlook Web Access and try to send another email, you will also see there is no email classification button. And the same reason that we don't have any policies or labels published to that user. We will see a different behavior once Maka published the labels. So back to you, Maka.
All right, so you can see the behavior there when there's no label policy in place. So what we're going to do now is publish the first set of labels to the entire user population, and then we'll do a second policy where we publish the highly confidential label to a very small number of users in the organization, thus allowing us to control which users in the organization see which labels and how those labels behave. So what we'll do now is we'll hit publish label in the information protection section and choose our sensitivity labels to publish. Now in this case, this is going to be the label policy that is applied to the majority of users in the organization. So for this, we want to select all of our labels except for highly confidential, like so. We'll choose the next button, and this is where we choose the scope. Who are we publishing these labels to? Now, in this case, I want to publish them to all users, so I'm going to choose next, and now we apply the settings. Firstly, we're going to choose users must provide a justification to remove a label or lower its classification. So in other words, if a user goes from a high sensitivity label to a lower sensitivity label, it will pop up a justification dialog box asking them why they're doing this, and we'll audit that. Our second option is require users to apply a label to their emails and documents. Now, this is also known as mandatory labeling. Now, mandatory labeling is when you must have a label applied to your email or document, and it will actually ask a user to do something about that if they fail to do so. Now, in our environment, for our first policy, we don't want to require this. We're going to allow the users to decide whether or not they apply a label to their documents or not. However, with highly confidential, that's very different. We want to make sure that any user that has access to highly confidential labels must add a label to their document. Doesn't necessarily have to be highly confidential, but because I have access to that label, I'm probably the type of person that should be applying a label to their email or document. And the last section here allows us to provide users with a link to a custom help page, which will appear at the bottom of their sensitivity drop-down button. Now, I don't have a custom help page, but for the sake of the demonstration, we're going to put in a URL here of tfwiki.net, which is probably the most useful web page on the entire internet. And now we'll click next, and we get asked whether we want to apply a default label. Now, a default label simply says whenever a new document or email is created, automatically apply the general label to it, as distinct from a mandatory label. A mandatory label is generally paired with no default label, so that when a user does not label their document, they are then forced to apply a label to their document through mandatory labeling. Now, in this case, this is our general policy, so we're going to allow the general label to be applied to any document or email by default, and then at least we're getting labeled in that way. However, for our next policy, we'll choose no default label with a mandatory, and then that will ensure that anyone with access to the highly confidential label has to think about what they're doing and apply a label before they move forward. You'll notice we have the ability to apply a different default label to emails as well. Now, in this case, for the Great Unwashed, we might choose no default label, or we might choose public, or something else. In this case, we'll choose no default label for emails, and then the users can decide what they wish to do. We'll choose next, and now we need to name our policy. Click next and submit that. Now, it's going to take a little bit of time to come into force, so we generally speaking say to wait about an hour to an hour and a half before that shows up in all of the Office applications. Of course, we need to produce our second policy as well. So we're going to do another label policy, and this time we're just going to publish the highly confidential label. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, hang on a minute. What happens to those people that are assigned to the highly confidential policy? Aren't they only going to see the highly confidential label and not any of the other labels? One of the great things to understand here is when you're a member of more than one policy, the labels assigned to those policies are additive. So because my first policy is published to all, everyone will get public, general, confidential, recipients only, confidential, internal only. And the AD group I'm going to publish this one to will also get highly confidential. So they see all of those labels. When it comes to the settings, however, the lowest policy in the list that you're a member of are the effective settings that you will get. So in this case, we'll choose to add highly confidential. This time we're going to change the users and groups this is associated to. And we're going to search for our group that we're interested in this case, COVID-19 research project. We'll click done. So just to recap, if I'm a member of COVID-19 research project, I will get all of the labels in the first policy that have been assigned to all users and groups, and the one extra label that's been assigned here. And the settings that I will get will be from this policy if I'm a member of the COVID-19 group, because that's the lowest in the list. Everybody else will get the settings from what they're a member of. In this case, we're going to choose must provide a justification, and we're going to go with a mandatory. And of course, we must have that incredibly important link to tfwiki.net. Otherwise, we could be in real trouble. Now, in this case, we're not going to apply a default label to documents because we are choosing to go with a mandatory label. And we're also not going to apply a default label to emails. But in this case, because I have access to that highly confidential label, I want to make sure that anyone in this group does apply a label to their email. And for this one, I will call it COVID-19 research label policy. A, adds highly confidential or COVID research. Click next and click submit. So now when this has created, we'll go back to our label definitions and we can see our two policies. The global policy that's highest in the list that everyone has access to, that gives us the majority of the labels, and the one lower in the list for the COVID-19 research label policy that gives access to the highly confidential label and gives those different settings just to those members of the group. So in our next episode, Waleed is going to show us what that looks like in the Office client.